Here's the I think the sixth part of my series of Beatles fantasy albums, albums that never were because they split up in 1970, but for this series I imagine that they didn't split up, and this is what they would come up with. Last episode I think, I finished with the Christmas 1973 single, which is Ding Dong on the A side and Picasso's Last Words on the B side. Probably the weakest Beatles single. I would say, to me, probably the weakest Beatles single since Ballad of John and Yoko, which wasn't a single in my scenario, so for my scenario probably the weakest Beatles single since, I don't know, From Me to You or something like that. So I'm aware this is probably not the best single, but that's the way it was. In my scenario it's also important to keep them all happy so that they don't split up. So they have to make some concessions to George and to Ringo, and so George has more A-sides in this fantasy world than he probably would have had in the real world. So Ding Dong is a very Christmassy song, so I think that's reason enough in my scenario for that. And then, all things must pass, to speak with the great George Harrison, in April 74. So in my scenario the band would stay together 4 more years, but in April 74 they eventually would split up, also in my scenario. There's a couple of reasons why for my fantasy scenario this is what I came up with. One of those reasons is, of course, that we are soon arriving at the house husband phase of John Lennon, so there's not much new material in the second half of the 70s that I could pick John songs from for future fantasy albums. And plus George's and Ringo's career, they really went downhill also in the later half of the 70s, so to make those albums sound really cool, those would be like 80% Paul McCartney driven albums, and then they are not Beatles albums, then they are missing something. So I think we'll see my thinking of why this would be a good time for them to split up as friends. In my dream they're still friends, so maybe they had some minor disagreements, of course, like they also had in the 60s, but they wouldn't be the big falling out in my fantasy. But anyway, they would split up, but not for always, just temporarily. You will see what I mean in the next episode, which is going to be the last episode in this series, which will be the comeback, but now the solo years, and it would they would put out like on the day that they announced the breakup, and like I said, since they're not enemies in this scenario, it would really be like a press conference with all 4 of them, and they all would talk to each other and talk to the press, and would be in good spirits, and they would immediately announce the, let's have a look, the Red, the Blue and the Green album, and that would all come out on the same day in April 74. The Red album would be 1962 to 1965, because it was always a bit awkward when the Red and Blue album was 1962 to 1966 and 67 to 70, because in hindsight there wasn't, 66 didn't have much in common with 62, 63, 64, so I think the early Beatles phase should be compiled in 62 to 65. Then the mid, like one could say the psychedelic phase, Rubber Soul, Revolver, Sgt. Pepper. So the Blue album would be 66, 69, and the Green album would start with when my fantasy albums start, the 70s, that would be 1970 to 1973. And each of those albums would be double albums, of course, would contain 30 tracks each, because I said it in one of my previous Beatle videos, I never understood why the Red album has 1 track less than the Blue album. There would have been so much, again, that's the way they treated the year 1966 on the Red album. was so strange. Just 3 songs, just 2 from Revolver, to some people the best album of all time. So it was strange that they had just 27 tracks on the original Red album and 28 on the Blue, because there would have been enough songs from 1966 to put on the Red album, Taxman or something like that, or Rain. So in my scenario, there are all tracks that deserve to be on the best of album will have their place on them. So it's 30 tracks for 1962 to 65, 30 tracks for 66 to 69, and 30 tracks from those last 2 or 3 albums that I compiled, and all those standalone singles like Maybe I'm Amazed, Instant Karma. So it would be a fantastic way to split up on the, you know, and show the world we're splitting up on the top, and we're splitting up as the best band in the world. Those 3 albums would dominate the charts in the, you know, in April, May, June 74. And then, you know, they have a really good start into their real solo careers, and McCartney would put out Wings. I don't know if this would be Wings in this scenario, if it just would be Paul solo with Linda and then session musicians, but he would release a 74 album which would include the best bits of Ram, Wildlife, Retro Speedway, Band on the Run, and all single tracks like Helen Wills and stuff. All the best tracks that I haven't yet used for, you know, in the previous episodes for albums like the 73 or 72 or 71 album. There would be enough material for a great 14-track McCartney album, I would say. Then in late 74 also George Harrison would release an album with, you know, the best tracks that haven't been used yet by myself for these Beatles albums. I think there's still lots of songs from Living in the Material World and of course from Dark Horse that he could put on such an album. April 75, 1 year after the split, would see the release of John Lennon's Rock and Roll album. He will put out an album in 76, that will be his last album for a couple of years, because also like with George and Paul, there's still enough material that I had for those 70s Beatles albums, tracks from Imagine album and Sometime in New York City, Mind Games, Walls and Bridges. So the best 10, 11, 12 tracks that I haven't yet used would also make a great last John Lennon album with self-penned songs. Paul McCartney would then also make in 78 a London Town kind of album with bits of, with the best songs also from Wings at the Speed of Sound, you know, something like Silly Love Songs and Let 'Em In, Beware My Love would also be on the album. So in my scenario, the albums are more focused and comprised. You know, imagine a London Town, but with the best songs of Wings at the Speed of Sound on it. George Harrison would release his 1979 George Harrison album, you know, maybe just the way it was, because this was a very, very good album to begin with. No need to take some other tracks for that. I think it's a great album the way it is. We haven't yet had much from Ringo, so he would put out in 1979 an album that includes the best bits of what in the real world would have been Rotogravure, Ringo the Fourth and Bad Boy, so to make one album with, you know, the best of these songs would be a decent Ringo album. Then again in 1979 McCartney would put out Back to the Egg, and in mid-1980 he would put out McCartney 2, and then the comeback of John Lennon. He would release Double Fantasy exactly the way it was in the real world, so it would be a John Lennon and Yoko Ono album with 6 or 7 tracks by John and 6 or 7 tracks by Yoko. So that would put an end to his house husband years also in this scenario. And then, you know, and this will be the next episode, the last episode of this series, then this is really the Beatles fantasy, and this is like fan fiction, you know, where we're getting what we really want, you know, what we always dreamed about, which is of course that John Lennon doesn't get shot on December 8th, 1980. And as we all, not all, but as some of us know, John Lennon had made plans to visit England for the first time since 1971. He had made plans in December 80 that he would go to England in early 81, also to have talks with the other Beatles about, not necessarily a reunion, like a big reunion, but about the Long and Winding Road project, which would in the 90s become Anthology. So they had at least a plan to work together on this documentary in 81 and put it out, I don't know, somewhere in the early 80s. So in my scenario, John Lennon doesn't get shot. He meets up with the other Beatles in, let's say, January 1981. The results of that meeting and what this would lead to will be the content of my next video.